Cicely Corry, very nice to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us on Let's Parent on Purpose.
Thank you for having me, Jay.
Now, as a pastor for quite some time, I'm well aware of Barna and the Barna Research Group. A bit of a research nerd myself, but many of the people listening, this might be the first exposure that they've ever had to Barna, although their pastors might have thrown out stats in the middle of sermons or things like that come from you guys. So would you just give a brief overview as what is Barna and what do you guys do?
Absolutely. Yeah, Barna is a research firm. And so we are especially interested in researching the intersection of church, big C, and a culture that we live in today. And so our main goal is to help leaders, to help parents, or wherever you're leading in your Christian context. It could be at home, at work, within your church. Want to help you to be able to be data informed and to understand the times, know what to do. We repeat that scripture often within our team, because it really does drive the work that we do. We've done studies that are about generations, usually emerging generations, which is some of the work we're going to talk about today. But we've also done research on discipleship and motherhood and parenthood, household rhythms. We're just starting to get into the intersection of faith and work, and research on entrepreneurship, and so there's a lot that Barna is doing, and we have great partners who come alongside us to dive into certain topics that are of great interest to the church. And as editorial director, I get to help tell some of those stories.
Now, how do you guys do your research? I've always been fascinated by that. Are you calling out people on the phone? Are you going with clipboards to places? How do you get people to actually respond? And yeah, just what's the methodology behind it?
Yeah, well, let me preface by saying, I just write the words, and I'm probably going to do our research team no justice with this answer.
Okay.
But I will say that, gone are the days, for the most part, of calling people up, or, sending out paper surveys, doing things on the spot, things like that. But we mostly do online surveys, and they're usually for general population. So, we weight things in a way that represents the population regardless of the responses that we get. But of course, we do want to make sure that certain demographics, age groups, that everybody's represented in the surveys that we send out. And then we also have a pastor panel. And the pastor panel, these are, pastors that sort of volunteer to be, well, I actually don't know if they volunteer. I think they do. I'm pretty sure they do. They're part of a panel that we get qualitative research from, where it'd be like open answers, but we also get quantitative, where we would survey them with something where they would have answers that they would, survey responses they choose from. But yeah, we also do focus groups. And so it all depends on what the research topic requires. We don't always do focus groups. We don't always do qualitative work. We don't always do quantitative work. But whenever we're diving into a topic, the main thing is that, we're representing a broad array of audiences and have like a good sample within all of those. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember the most personally, I don't know, weighty statistic that I have heard from Barna, and that was the area that I live in. So I live smack in the middle between West Palm Beach and Fort Pierce. And there was a study that came out a number of years ago that we were the number one never churched region, like larger city area in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's pretty shocking, especially having come from West Virginia, the heart of the Bible Belt, where everybody has had some experience in church. And there's, if you don't like the one on your street corner, just walk 3 doors down and you'll find another one. How many people here had just never experienced church whatsoever? And I see that as we interact with our students. They often feel lonely and isolated in their schools. When I drive out of my neighborhood on Sundays, the vast majority of people are still in their house, still, and they're there when I leave and they're there when I come back. But that was a really telling thing. And it was a pivotal moment in our church of realizing, my goodness, we want to do world missions. Absolutely. But we really have to up our game as far as our personal mission field, because we're right in it.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring up that research. That was done prior to me starting at Barna. But I tell you, there are so many pastors that I talk to who say that they have been informed by our city's data, where we would go out and just give like a snapshot of the spiritual, beliefs of those that are in a certain proximity. And that really is what it's all about. Like, we're helping people to see people that they care about, or people that they know, or people that are right next door to them in the data. And I think that that is what can sort of prompt action and invigorate leaders in a way that's like, okay, this is a number. I no longer have assumptions about the people that I serve or the people that I want to reach. Now I have a number that can motivate me and that can, become like a launching point for certain ministry and certain practices that take place within my church. So that really is what it's about.
Yeah. So if I'm not a pastor, if I'm just a mom or a dad, I've never been a mom, but if I'm a parent who loves the Lord, and what is the best value for me as far as Barna? Like, what would be the ways that you would encourage just your regular mom and dad that are trying to raise a family and live for Jesus? How might they benefit from engaging in your all's work?
You're speaking my language now. I've got 2 toddler boys, and so I am a mom who really wants to make sense of this. And before I came to Barna and started doing what I do now, I was actually someone who just clicked on Barna's website out of general intrigue. Like, I think I'd seen, an article somewhere about some recent research, and then I realized that there was a wealth of information that goes far beyond what a pastor can do in their own time and limits and all of that. And I think that that is inspiration to parents and to youth leaders and to volunteers and to, CEOs and anyone that's listening to this who is a Christian who wants to live out their faith. So I think that when it comes to our research, the way that it's valuable is that it helps you to know the world that you're living in. So, for instance, we recently did some research on faith in AI, on artificial intelligence, and in polling parents, we came to know that parents actually have a general skepticism toward artificial intelligence and how it might influence their children, but they actually don't understand the technology at all. And so that can, like, if you know that, what your kids think about AI and how they're engaging with it, how they're using it, when we see the data, we actually see that, yes, young people are using artificial intelligence, but they actually do have some boundaries when it comes to it. And so there's like this angst and this misunderstanding that I think data can help to provide some calm and some resolve for, to say, yes, this is actually what's happening, or no, it's actually not as bad as it seems. And it's probably a word even for, the church at large, and especially pastors, is that, like, if you turn on the news right now and you think you ask, the general population or general people that about their perspective of the church and its impact, you might assume that you get a certain response. But our data tells us that it's not all doom and gloom. And even though some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today there are troubling things that come in data, but there are also like hope-filled, inspiring opportunities. And I think that is what can be motivating for any parent, any leader, any person that's serving, any older adult. We've got a whole study that we did on aging adults. So yeah, I'm inspired by the work that I get to be a part of. And I see myself in the work that we do, because I was once there, being a mom and someone who is serving at my church, a leader in my church, and thinking like, this is not stuff for me. This is stuff for my pastor to do, the one in charge to do, the one that is, got the call to shepherd. And then when I started to dig deeper, I realized, like, no, God calls all of us to make a difference in our own ways in carrying out the work of his kingdom. And
Love that.
Our studies can help them do that.
Yeah. So I was thinking, as you sharing that, just about different statistics and how they can open your eyes to things. One way that I could imagine this stuff actually having a really practical use in your household, especially as your kids get older. With toddlers, maybe a little more difficult, but once you get elementary and middle and high school age kids, dinner table conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's so much good stuff for these, and just so sometimes we have a standard list of questions that we ask at dinner time. But I've noticed if you ask kids like, "How was your day?" How's school going? It's one word answers. But if you can say, hey, you know what? I just read that 38% of kids are all into AI, but 72% of parents are super skeptical of it. Where do you think that we fit in that as a family? Are you in on there? And what's your perception of what mom and dad think? And you could actually, it's really funny. You could take that Barna article, you could throw it into Chat GPT and say, can you give me 5 or 6 questions to ask my kids about this at dinner for conversation? So it's funny because that skeptical AI really does, I think things like that, where I've noticed if I can ask my children questions that are not specifically pointing at them, but what do you observe in your school? So I'm not attacking their friends and I'm not attacking them. Sometimes they'll really open up and teach me quite a bit. It's like, no, it's not like that at all. Or sometimes, yeah, it's way worse than you ever thought, Dad. So that's a great use of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with that. Yeah.
So specifically, what got my attention with wanting to talk to you was a recent study that you all did that shows a trend that I think is the first time I've ever heard anything like this, where, and I'll let you get into it, but from what I understand, you're seeing that for the first time ever, you're having a higher percentage of young women walk away from the faith, that we, not you, but we as the church, we're seeing a higher percentage of young women walk away from the faith as young men. And so I'm sad about that. I'm fascinated about it, but go into it. Am I accurate in what I'm saying, or what's the nuance behind it?
You are accurate, and there's a lot of nuance behind it. But so we have been studying Gen Z, and just for the sake of those listening, when Barna studies Gen Z, we're talking about those from age 13 all the way up to age 24. So teenagers, and then kind of that young adult age. And what we're seeing within that young adult age of 18 to 24 is that young women, that 38% of them currently identify as not having any faith. And that's compared to 32% of young men. Young men. And so this is the first time, usually it's flipped, where in most of our studies that we have done, I mean, we're talking about over a decade, more than a decade, that women have always been more engaged in church, attending more, volunteering more grounded in their faith. We see this with mothers being the natural leaders of spiritual formation within their households. And so this is something that we're seeing with all women, but we're especially watching with young women because that's the future of the church there. And so I think that because this is now where young men are they're creeping up. I mean, that's good news for the young men that they're feeling engaged, but at the same time, there's the counter of that is that young women are disengaging. And so we're starting to ask questions to get to the heart of why. And I think that, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll remember my thought.
No, I was just going to say, I think that is what we're going to be talking about here today. So it was a pitch to you.
Okay. So one of my first questions would be, is this absolute or relative? So for instance, it could be that years ago, 40% of young men identified as having no faith, and now only 32% does, whereas, the women went the opposite direction. Is it one of these issues where both men and women are identifying more and more as having no faith, or you're seeing that young men used to identify as having no faith, and less of them are doing that, and more of the women are? I don't know if I said that right. I hope you can get what I'm saying in there.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Is it absolute or comparative? Maybe
it's that less young men previously, and men in general, identified as having faith.
Okay, so as time has gone on, we are now seeing a trend where more young men are claiming to have faith than used to be. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's great news.
Yeah,
But
that's
on the
great
other
news.
right, but on the other side, we're seeing that less young women are identifying as having faith as they did in the past.
Right. And so you see that the people, those who, if this is the positive side and the negative side, we're seeing that those who are once over here, so this number's going down, this number's going up. That's what's happening over time. Yeah.
Okay. So the $1 trillion question, why? So I would love to just dig, I have a ton of spitball ideas, but I'm curious, were there any obvious things that stood out to you guys as to like why this was happening?
Well, this is something that I can't, it's certainly something that came as a surprise to me. But then when we started to look at insights that we're getting from other research, I think we sort of have hints to what might be pushing this in the direction. We have not specifically asked Gen Z why they do or don't believe. And I think that is, part of the conversation and part of the surveying that we're going to start to do, because this is now a new trend. What I will say, though, is that in our previous research, we've seen how loneliness, especially during the pandemic, there was a loneliness epidemic. And it could be that young women, especially, are having a hard time, getting back into socializing. And I maybe sort of anecdotally, I think about how easy it is for my husband to make a friend. He sees a guy at work or at the gym, twice. And then after that, they're going and they're hanging out, like best friends. That is not so for me, for sure, but and for many of the women that I know. And so it could be that young women are not feeling safe enough to sort of insert themselves into more social life in general, but also when it comes to now putting your place within the church. Well, we have seen how the unfortunate behavior of church leaders, of men in power in church, how women have been misused, how there has been, bad behavior, sexual misconduct, things of that sort. That then can project a, that the church is not a safe place for women. We also have debates about, women in leadership and things of that sort. And certainly that's not a debate I want to get into right now, but it's a real thing that Gen Z, who is very tech heavy, always online, they know all the news and all the things that is given to them in the spaces that they're in. And so if these are things that are the messages that they're receiving, that young women are receiving about the church, that can start to sort of give the message that they aren't welcome there, that they don't belong there, that they won't have a sense of belonging or a sense of empowerment there. They won't have a sense of community there. So I think this is something for churches to start wrestling with, of how safe are the spaces that we have for young women to enter into? How can we begin to encourage and, sort of put down, though, any uneasiness that a young woman might have for inserting themselves into church community? But I think more than anything, this is about this. Well, let me not say this is about. It could be about that, young women are not seeing value in church going, not seeing value in believing in God. They don't see how, for whatever reason, they're not fully seeing how, going and attending church and immersing themselves in church community is of benefit to them. I think that's something for us to pay attention to.
I want to circle back to one of the first potential causes that you talked about, that friendship community aspect, because I've been a youth pastor for 25 years, more or less, and I realized that even, the kids who look super faithful, who really love their church, most of them are not going out of their way to show up here because they love my teaching. I think I'm a pretty good teacher. I try to be engaging. I think the kids like their youth pastor, but they're coming for friends, and
Absolutely.
it's like, and we're okay with that. Like, come for friends, and you're going to get Jesus slow drip to you along the way. And over time, your faith's going to deepen. But that friendship community aspect is so vital. And I will say, I've said over the years, my observation is, and it's funny because I think it was that, I don't remember who the author was. There was this book a long time ago, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And they use this illustration of like men's brains work like a waffle, where there's just a bunch of squares and everything is separate and compartmentalized. And women's brains are like a bowl of spaghetti noodles where everything touches everything else. And, I've said it somewhat in jest, and then the kids, they see it and agree. You can have two guys that have literally one commonality, and they can keep a 20-year friendship with that one commonality. Like, I've had basketball buddies that, like, that's it, man. I might think you're a dirtbag in the rest of your life. I may not trust you with my kids or my finances, but we can have a 20-year relationship at the gym, and that feels like a good friendship, and it'll grow from there. Yeah. So one commonality can keep a friendship for a very long time for guys. And when I interact with guys, that's all I'm really looking for in a new relationship. I just got to find that one thing, because if I find that one thing, we can build from there. Whereas with young ladies, it feels like one disagreement can shatter the friendship. So if there's one thing that is not in common, oftentimes they can't get past that. They overlook it. And so that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but there is some truth to it. I see over and over again that, women seem to be more socially complex than men, and therefore their relationships are more socially complex. And we see this in our small groups that we will often, it will be harder for girls to click in small group than it is guys, because I think sometimes the girls are looking for more, but they're all so young and they're all still developing. So while they're looking for it, they're sometimes not ready to give it. And so, then they all sit around thinking everybody's got friends except me. Everybody fits in except me. Meanwhile, the person next to them is thinking the same thing, and the person next to them is thinking the same thing. So I do feel like that, that community aspect. And one of the remedies that I see is, like, as parents, I think we have to empathize with that instead of just saying, oh, everybody's like that. I do think listening and empathizing, but also, not enabling their isolation, where, because I'll have parents that do that sometimes. Like, we came for 3 weeks. They just didn't find their people, so we're not coming. It's like, well, yeah, it takes time. And really what it takes is shared experiences. And so if you're just showing up at church for the minimum box checker, most likely you're not going to develop good relationships. But if you'll get involved in activities, if you'll serve together, if you'll, power through those first few trips, that's where, like, common experiences is how people form deeper relationships, not just because they came and heard the same teaching. It's because they experienced some bit of life together. And I don't know if you guys are seeing anything like that in what you've looked at.
Absolutely. Applauding everything that you just noted. And I think the heart of that is the intentionality that it requires. Whether you're a parent, whether you're a leader, whether you're just someone who cares about young people, it doesn't matter. It's going to require intentionality. And I think that might be part of how we got here, is that it can be easy to do ministry as usual. I've checked the box of small groups. I've checked the box of discipleship. I've checked the box of outreach. I've checked the box of showing up every Sunday and preaching and people volunteering. But for a flourishing church, a thriving church, you have to dig deeper to figure out folks who are going to slip through the cracks without without any notice. And before you know it, you look up and you're like, man, when all these dudes get in my church? Right. And so anecdotally, I can see that because, my husband and I, we lead the student ministry at our church. I've been in student ministry for 10, 15 years. And what we're starting to see now is exactly what we're seeing in Barna data, where we've got a whole bunch of testosterone-filled guys in our youth group, and they just overpower the girls that are the young ladies that are in there. And it's like, you're just like, oh, let's shadow box. Let's shadow box. Like, dude, sit down. First off, you're about to hit her in the face, by accident. But at the same time, I'll have a side conversation with a young lady who's really struggling with something, or has this deep spiritual question that she just didn't have, she didn't feel like she had the space or the opportunity to say it within the context of the full youth group, because there was energy being drawn elsewhere. And what we began to realize is that part of our role as leaders is to help to ensure that there's a welcoming space for all parties involved. Now, this isn't me saying that the solution is to, create a kumbaya with everybody, because reaching and pleasing everyone is impossible, and you know this as a leader. But you can begin to ask questions of the young ladies that you cross paths with. How did you feel about this conversation? What is it? What would you like to see us do in youth group? What are some questions that you have? What are some topics that you may want us to cover? What are some outings or some personal interests that you have? As a matter of fact, what do you do in school? Are you a cheerleader? Can I come to your next fill in the blank? And taking small moments to be intentional above and beyond what's required. Really, all I'm required to do is come in, teach them well, and take a lead in the conversation that's taking place. But that's my bare minimum. And I think that because of the culture that we live in, and because we're competing with so much information and so many messages that young people in general are getting, as parents, as leaders, as mentors, we have to be willing to say, okay, I'm going to go above and beyond to meet a child, to meet a young person where they are. And I think that is really what it's going to take.
I really love that. I was thinking of another one of the initial potential reasons that you shared, and that being the leadership lid, sometimes on young ladies. And, denominationally speaking, different churches have different standards on male and female leadership. But what I've noticed, like, for instance, I'm in a Baptist church. We have male elders and pastors in our church. But there are a lot of leadership things that can happen that young ladies and women can do. It's the same, it's kind of like if in your church, young people and teenagers only get to do leadership stuff within children's ministry or youth group, then they ultimately don't feel like they're a part of the church. So, a church that wants to keep the next generation can't wait till they graduate high school and then get past their 20s and then wait for, Flo and Herbert to die before they're allowed to open the door and say hi to people. But in the same way, there are so many genuine leadership positions that are not biblical offices that women flourish at. It doesn't matter what your gender is. As a matter of fact, you need people of both genders to do this. And I think we need to be intentional about empowering everybody in the church, including our ladies, to have meaningful ways to help carry the load of the church. Yes. Where you're not just a butt in the seat, and you're not, the Bible doesn't say for all women to submit to all men. So that's not, that's not what the church should be modeling. And I think that sometimes, it's interesting because what I see in classrooms, a lot of times girls tend to have better grades and tend to excel a lot of times in classrooms because it's hard for boys to sit still and listen. But sometimes in church settings, because boys are louder and more brash, a young man will be more quickly given a leadership position, just simply because they're, more wiggly, more outgoing, more loud. And so noticing and giving them places of empowerment. And also sometimes if they're quiet and shy, recruit that as well and be like, hey, I know you're shy and I know you're quiet, but that also means you probably have an incredible radar for other people that are walking in this room that feel insecure. And just like when you came the first few times, you felt super insecure, if somebody would just go up and talk to you. And so like, there are so many different like unofficial leadership roles that we can give young people to help them engage and to empower them. And so I feel like just saying that your denominational male-female leadership structure is not a good excuse for disempowering 50% of the workforce in your church, 50% of the souls in your church. And so you can have, you can try to be biblically faithful to what you believe the Bible says about specific leadership roles. And yet your goal is to equip the saints, not equip the men and the boys, but equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ.
Absolutely. And this is something that we've seen play out in our research. We haven't asked this specifically of Gen Z women, but we did a study of moms a couple of years ago. It's called Motherhood Today. Phenomenal report, probably one of my favorite reports, because I felt seen and heard in that research. And I'm not saying it just because of what I do, but there was a couple of survey questions that related to leadership within their church, and we saw that mothers who had visible female leadership within their church, they felt more empowered. They felt like they had a voice in their church. They felt more connected to their church community. And thereby, they feel like they are more empowered to show up and show up well. And I think that is something for leaders to, take into consideration, is that we do see in our research how women in a visible leadership role. And so and it doesn't even have to be, like you said, it doesn't have to be a formal church role, but there are leadership ways that you can show that a woman is leading something. There are ways that you can show that, and it's not just, it's not just administration. This is about really taking the time to figure out the spiritual gifts that people have and the gifts and talents that people have, and figuring out ways that the church can be utilized in the church and even beyond. Another thing I'll say is that the role of mentorship and the role of a confidant is incredibly important in any young person's life. And in that same motherhood study, we saw how the role of a confidant can play a significant role in a mother's life. And I say that because that was a study of women, and there are some anecdotal things that we can start to, form some of the questions that we ask for the young women in our lives. Do you have someone you can go to confide in? Do you have someone that you look up to? And many times you may see that these young women don't, and they have unanswered questions and unanswered insecurities and things that mentorship and having a confidant, like these are ways of walking alongside young women that I think can be incredibly valuable, in addition to, in the spaces where they are present, that they can see how they hold value, physically see that, and also emotionally, spiritually, mentally, they can, embrace that. I think that is one of many solutions that, just takes a little more intentionality, asking the right questions, listening well, but it also requires, a little bit of work. You've got to extend the invite, extend the hand, extend a listening ear, and you may see results that started out with one small gesture, but they're really incremental.
Love that. So, Cicely, as we, it's been really fascinating. I feel like I could pick this apart for hours.
Yeah.
But just thinking specifically from a mom and dad, and some of these are things that we have mentioned already, and I know that you're saying that you guys are ready to go do much greater follow-up on the why question. But just thinking specifically as a mom and dad, if I've got a daughter, and my heart is for them to love Jesus and stay connected with the church and grow deeper in their faith. Are there some just key things that you guys have realized? These, nothing is guaranteed. Like even Proverbs, train up a child in the way they will go, in the end they won't depart from it. That's a principle, not an ironclad promise, because sometimes you do the best you can and a child leaves their faith. But are there some specific things that you all have realized on the whole, these kinds of practices tend to give you the best shot of your child, your daughters growing and thriving in their faith?
Yeah, well, one thing that I do want to be mindful of is that research is meant to inform, but it's not always prescriptive.
Sure.
It's not always, do this and you'll get this result.
Yes.
And also, it could be that just because you have a daughter that fits, the age range of Gen Z, doesn't mean also that they're on the negative side of this number that we're talking about. And so I think that that's important to say. Another thing is I want to encourage parents a little bit, because even though we see that young women are more young women, are identifying as no faith, here's the nuance that I talked about earlier, right? We also see that Gen Z are starting to believe in Jesus at a higher rate.
That's great.
Now, I know that you can think, okay, well, how can you believe in Jesus at a higher rate, but then, the rate of no faith is increasing as well? The number is 61%. 61% of female Gen Z say that they have made a decision to follow Jesus that's still important to them today. And that's not just people who we say, that's not just Christian respondents.
It's a general public response.
It's the general public. Okay. And so we have this intrigue about spiritual matters amongst Gen Z. We have this intrigue about Jesus among Gen Z. But it also is that they are they have this openness to spiritual things, but they don't necessarily have a biblical foundation to root that in. And so when a young person says that they believe in Jesus, that is a door. That is an opportunity to say, okay, you've accepted Christ, but for some reason, we're certainly not seeing that number when it comes to people who self-identify as Christian. I think that some of what we're dealing with here is institutional, where Gen Z is not wanting to associate themselves with the institution of church.
Okay.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're spiritually broken, or that, there's this this decline in faith in spiritual matters. Or, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that just because we have this number of young women identifying as no faith doesn't mean that they have no interest in God, no interest in Jesus, no interest in having faith at all. It actually, I believe, is starting to allude more to like institutional things that Gen Z as a whole does not want to associate with when it comes to the Big C church. And not necessarily that I don't want anything to do with God. I don't want anything to do with Jesus. But it's so as a church, we've got to start to ask ourselves, what is it historically that the image of the church that we need to repair, the reputation of the church that needs to be repaired? What matters are being discussed in culture today that the church is not doing a very good job of leading well in these conversations and being open to hearing how young people feel about fill in the blank topic.
Sure.
Gen Z is a very cause-driven generation. And so I think that is a way, an on-ramp for parents to start asking questions about the matters that they care about, the questions that they're asking about the wrongs in the world, and what they're hearing about the wrongs in the church. Because it could be that, some of that is misconstrued. It could be that some of that is true. But if you don't know until you ask. I say all of that to say that when it comes to parents who are listening, and the things that you can be doing with the young people in your life, as well as your own children who are fitting into this Gen Z category, if you haven't gathered it yet, you can listen to them and ask good questions. And I love your what you said earlier about, sort of using data and research and insights to like be conversation starters. And that's incredibly important because it also helps you to understand the information that your child already, or the assumptions that your child may be making about the world that they live in, and you can help bring understanding and clarity to that. Another thing that is important is just community. We do see that faith community is valuable and can be transformational in a young person's life. And so, even if you've got a young daughter who is like, I don't really want to go today. I think, there's balance to that, nudging them a little bit, but also providing like the benefits, allowing them to see how the benefits of being in faith community, and some of the things that they can access, and people that they can talk to, and spaces that they can be themselves wholly and fully. I think it's up to parents to help their child take a step like that. I mean, how often does God do that with us, where we're like, I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I'm really supposed to do that. I tell the young people I work with all the time that I feel like God is funny because he often calls introverted people to do extroverted things. I'm one of those people. I'm an introvert by nature, but he calls me to do extroverted things because that allows him to fill the gap and to help us and to lean on him, as opposed to our own understanding and our own ability and our own gifts and talents. And so therefore, every time when I do something like this, I know that it's nothing but God, because it's out of my nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's things like that that can help a young person be bolder in their uncertainty, realizing that it might not be so bad after all, after I take a few steps in this direction. And as parents, we remind them that even if you take a few steps and it gets weird, little awkward, I'm still going to love you. I'm still going to be there for you. And I'm still going to be in your corner cheering for you. So.
All right. So I feel like summarizing that curiosity in your conversations with them. So instead of just lecturing, seek to ask questions, be curious, be genuinely curious, and then community and not just church services. So we need to help them find a vibrant spiritual community and not just be checking off showing up at a church service instead. So there's very little value in just coming to a church service for faith retention. But if they can find a real community that they can stick with and grow with, be brave with, try new things, fail, and still be loved and accepted, feels like that goes a long way towards helping them stick in their faith. And that's probably the very same thing for your guys as well. It's not just girls. That's just good parenting advice all around. Curiosity and community. So, Cicely, thank you so much for this conversation. It really is fascinating. Barna has a few different resources that I have in my show notes for people. The Barna website, barna.com. You have this Gen Z study that has been released, as well as you have Access Plus. Well, the Gen Z study makes, like, I can understand what a study on Gen Z is. What is the Barna Access Plus? Just before we go real quick, would you let us know what that is?
Yep. So Barna Access Plus is essentially a digital library of Barna Research, and it's membership based, and it's for, a leader in any Christian context. And so it could certainly be for parents who want to explore what we have researched about a specific topic. And so these are research on church, culture, parenting, household rhythms, work, spiritual gifts. The list goes on. And so it's a monthly or an annual membership, however you want to do it, but it gives you digital access to our reports. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Hey, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you and your wisdom. And moms and dads, as you're listening, thanks for listening through. And I pray that you are able to stay curious as you talk with your kids and strive for community.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jay. It's been great.